G'day, welcome to chapter 1 of making our beautiful Artie, our art doll Dalmatian in the large size. We're going to start in this chapter. In this chapter we're going to be making the body, and we're going to start with the tail. So we've got our two tail pieces here. They are interfaced felt. I'm using pure wool felt for the tail because I'm going to be airbrushing. You certainly can use any acrylic washable felt will work as well. I just like the wool felt on the areas that I'm going to be needle felting or airbrushing. So I'm just going to put those right sides together, add a couple of clips, and I'm going to sew with a single strand of extra strong thread. I'm going to just overcast around the whole outside edge and leave this top section open. Once I've done that, I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to sew the same seam, and I'm going to sew it 2 times because we're stuffing this tail nice and firm. Make sure you go back and forth on your start and finish. I have my stitch length set on my machine, set to number 2, and I'm using a 100% polyester cotton in my for my machine thread, and do make sure that your seam allowance is 4 millimeters. You can go ahead and turn that tail through once you've done your stitching, and do make sure to push that tip out really well, roll out those seams, and now we can go ahead and fill that one. A pair of forceps are best for this job. You want to get right down to the end there. It does need to be packed firm because we're adding a joint. It doesn't have to be super firm through the middle section, but definitely at the end, at either end. So I just pack it the same consistency all the way through, and making sure I'm getting right down there to the tip. And I'm going to fill this up all the way to just a little way from the edge. I'm going to use my wool felting needle to get in there and pack all of that filling in so that it's nice and flat before we add that tail joint. I have that tail all beautifully filled out now. You can see that's quite firm, and I've gone ahead and used my felting needle, packed in all of that stuffing. It's nice and flat, and then my next step is to take a double strand of extra strong thread, and I have sewn a running stitch just about 3 millimeters in from the edge all the way around, left my tail ends hanging, and then tied my first knot. We're going to add that tail joint, drop that in there, make sure it's nicely centered. Super easy to do with a tail. Pull in those thread ends nice and tight as you can around that bolt, and then knot that off at least 4 times before snipping those threads. There we go, so that completes our tail. I always add the other pieces of my joint. It does help flatten that tail down. That can sit there while we're creating the rest of the body. We will be doing a tiny little bit of airbrushing on the tail. So now we're going to move on. I'm going to be inserting the footage from making the body of my medium art doll, which is a goat. Now the medium art doll of course is slightly smaller. Pattern pieces are all the same as in how we construct them and put them together. Also the undershirt is put together in the same way. For the undershirt on the Dalmatian, I'm going to be using this soft red fleece. You can use the t-shirt material, as you'll see me use with putting together the goat body. Follow those instructions. Most of you have put this body together a million times, so you can probably even just jump ahead. I will see you back here when I have my body all made and that undershirt. So welcome to chapter 1, and here we are going to be making the body and the arms and the legs of our medium size art doll. So our first step with our back pieces of the body, I'm going to start with the body. The first thing I do is I sew a close zigzag stitch right on the edge of that opening, both sides. That protects that opening, it stops it from stretching. We're going to be filling the body through here, jointing through that back section, so you need it to stay true and not stretch. So once that's done, we put right sides together because this is our centre back seam. right sides together, line everything up, and we're going to sew the centre back seam but leave that opening. So we're going to start at the top here and stitch a 4mm seam allowance. I always overcast everything before I sew it, so that's just something that I've always done. It gives me beautiful finish and it's really worth the extra time to do it. It means that it doesn't slip, the pieces won't slip under the machine, and everything fits together better in the end. So every seam that I sew, I will do that first. So I will stitch down to this mark. Make sure that you really back and forth and at your openings and your finishes on everything, and same at the end of the opening down to the bottom here and back and forth. And I do sew every seam 2 times. And I will also add that I always use a jeans needle in my sewing machine, and I have my stitch length set to number 2, so it's a nice small stitch. Turn that one through, and then I've removed just some of my top stitching, my overcasting, so that I can open that seam out nice and flat. Press that nice and flat, either end, top and bottom. So now we just put right sides together, and we're going to line up with your centre mark straight through that seam junction there, and we're going to stitch that same 4mm seam allowance across the top, and then do the same for the base, and again straight across the base there. And again, turn those through and roll those seams out. So we've got the start of our body there. Flip that one back around. You can also see that I've taken out my overcasting stitch just on the edges on each side, so that I can flatten that seam again, because my next step now is I'm going to go ahead and add my first side gusset. So our little peanut shape here, you've got the top of your body here, the narrow end goes to the top, this wider part fills out the belly section. So what we're going to do is, it's just like putting in a head gusset, where we take our centre point and put a pin and our seam allowance straight through that centre mark and straight through that centre seam. Do make sure it's really well lined up. Just go straight through that seam, and I pin it in just like I do a head gusset, if you've seen me do that before. So I take my pin through all the layers, flip it over and take up a little bit on the other side, and then I go across to the other side. I'm lining up those edges. You'll find if you've kept to your seam allowances correctly, this little piece will fit in absolutely beautiful. So you can see I'm just going to make my way around. I often like to anchor the base section in the same way, opening up that seam and taking that pin through. And I will continue to pin until that is all fitted in all the way around. So there you can see I have one of those side gussets all overcast into place now, so all my pins are gone and it's much easier to stitch that seam. Now you can just stitch the whole thing on the machine, but I find it's much easier if I just go ahead and I hand stitch with a stab back stitch the 2 top curves, because then I can just sew the sides on the machine. It's just easier, and I want everything to be really lined up and accurate, and that's hard to do on the machine on those tight curves. So I've got my extra strong thread, and it's a single strand, and I'm simply going to sew a stab back stitch. Most of you will know this stitch by now. So just coming up from behind, going through all of the layers. It's the best stitch for hand stitching soft sculpture, coming up from behind, and each time I'm going back into the hole, the exit hole that I just came out of. So the stitch is fully linked. If you're not familiar with this stitch, you can check out my YouTube channel pay it forward and you will see that I've got all the basic stitches there for you, videos that show you up close how to sew that stitch. But it's just a matter of keeping those stitches nice and even at the same seam allowance of 4mm, and it just makes it easier overall. And I want that lovely perfect finish on those ends. Makes everything sit better, the arms will sit better if everything's even. So you can see there that stitch. I will just continue, do both those curves, and again then get this one stitched up on the machine. There you can see I've just turned that side through and rolled those seams out. Pop that one back through, and then you can go ahead and add the second gusset in exactly the same way as that one. Now once we have that all stitched up, the next step is to add our joint holes. So I do that using my awl at each of those joint spots and just enlarging those holes a little with my knitting needle. And also you need to make an opening at the very top, so right in line with that center mark there, just straight through that seam. And again, just enlarging it a little, just big enough for your bolt to pass through, or your cotter pin, whichever you're using with your joints. So now we can just turn that one through and push all those seams out. And that completes our body, and so that's all ready to go. We can pop that one aside and we can get started on our arms and legs. Let's start with the arms. So we're going to start with the top section of our arms, and we're just going to put right sides together with those. And we're going to be stitching from the base up to almost the top here. Now there'll be a mark on your pattern templates, there should be there, I haven't popped that in on mine, I know where that goes. Just close to the top there. We leave the top section open because that's how we're going to add our joint, and then we're going to be closing that top section with a blanket stitch. So it's just stitching either side up until that mark that you'll have on your template. I will overcast, of course, those seams first before I stitch them 2 times, and do make sure you back and forth on those start and finishes. So that's how you stitch the upper arms. And the lower arms, they are just also right sides together, lining that all up. We're going to leave the top edge open, and we're going to be stitching that same 4mm seam allowance right the way around, and again 2 times, and make sure you back and forth on the start and finish. I have all those arm sections all turned through, and I've rolled out all of those seams, so they're all ready to go. We can pop those aside and we'll move on to putting together our legs, and they're put together in much the same way. So we have each pair, we've got an inside leg which has our joint spot just as we had with our arms, and an outside leg. So pair those up, and in the same way as we did with the tops of the arms, we're going to stitch only up until the mark that you'll have on your pattern on each side, and do the same with the other one. And then with the lower leg section, we are going to stitch from the top to the heel and from the top to the toe. And obviously we're going to leave this foot section open because we're going to be adding a foot pad. Again, all of those pieces will be overcast and they will be stitched twice on the machine. So I have my leg pieces all stitched, and now I'm going to go ahead and pin in those foot pads into those lower legs. I have taken a few of those overcasting stitches out on both sides so that I can flatten those seams out at the toe and the heel. We've got our little foot pad piece, put that in right sides together. It's just like putting in those side panels that we did with the body. A pin straight through at the seam allowance, goes straight through that seam. We do the same on the back of the heel. Straight through that mark and in straight through that seam at the back. And then we just fit that one in. You can actually pin the front of this foot because I've designed it to be more of a humanized foot and sit quite flat, you can put a couple of pins in straight. So it'll hold that section nice and flat. We want to be able to put little shoes on these dolls, and the foot shape needs to be less club-like. So just a matter of tucking those edges in, lining that all up, and we have that one pinned into place. Now you can go ahead and overcast that one, and then you can sew it in either entirely by hand, which is what I will do using a stab back stitch, the same one we used on the curves of that body, or alternatively you can just hand sew in this lower section of the heel, because you won't get that under the machine, and then you could sew this top section on the machine. Either way, totally up to you. I will probably just hand sew them both in because I've done so many, it's probably quicker just to do that. I now have all of those legs completed and turned through, rolled out those seams, so I can put the lower legs and the lower arms aside, and we're just going to deal with the upper legs and the upper arms. So you can see on this one that I've pulled back that top section. I've made my hole through the joint mark, and I've slipped my appropriate joint in there. Now I've glued it up first because I'm using my nut and bolt method. If you're using cotter pins, you don't need to do that, you can just slip that in. I've got mine glued up ready to go with my clear craft glue, and I'm just going to pop these. So these are the leg joints that are going in, so just tuck it in there, and we make sure that all of that felt is pressed right up against and around that bolt. And do the same with the other leg. That just stops that disc spinning when we tighten it to the body. And it means that we can close the limb off the animal, which is much easier to do. There we go. So we'll leave those to dry. I've got the arm section, the top of the arm. This one is already dry, and I'm just going to close that top opening with a blanket stitch. So I've got my pearl thread here ready. I've just come in between the two layers, and I'm just going to sew a nice close little blanket stitch. Blanket stitch is just taking your needle through all of those layers and bringing it out through that thread loop each time. That will give you a nice binding stitch. Check out my Pay It Forward channel for all of your basic stitches. Lots of videos there to help you out with those. And you can see that's just going to close that top opening really nicely, and it's much easier than sewing a ladder stitch closing. Well, I find it easier anyway. So, and everything sits nice and flat around that joint. So I'm going to get each of those joints all in place. I'm going to add my next one on my arm and stitch all of those top edges of those legs and arms. So now I have all of my limb pieces ready and those top openings are closed. What we're looking to create here is this little arm. So this is a completed little arm with that lovely little bead ball joint in the middle, and it is such a lovely quirky little professional finish with beautiful mobility. So how we get the ends of each of these pieces ready for that ball joint, I'm going to show you now. So first of all, I'm going to demonstrate on the upper leg sections for you. So the first thing is that we've got to pack the top of this thigh piece nice and firm. So this is where our leg is going to be attached to the body. The top there, we've already got that joint in there. And I'm going to really pack it firm, just as I have with the top of this arm here. So I'm going to get that one filled, and I'll be using my wool felting needle too to pack those fibres in. So fill it just up to about 3/4. So I have that one filled about 3/4 full, and then I've gone ahead and I've turned just the lower edge of that thigh in, and it's probably just over a 1/2 centimetre that I've turned in. It's not an exact measurement, but it's whatever you can get it turned in nice and comfortably, and that it sit there well. Make sure that you really press it out, and then I'm just going to slip my needle in underneath there, because what I want to do, I've got a knot in the end, it's my extra strong thread, and I'm just going to sew a little running stitch just a little way in, keeping it as invisible as I can, and it's just to hold that hemline in place. You'll find if you keep your stitches really tiny on the outside, it really won't be visible. And it really is just a tacking stitch, but it does stay in. So right the way around that little cuff edge, or this, in this case it's a little knee. And it's just, the purpose is just to hold that hem in place. So once you have that little base hemmed into place, you can go ahead and keep adding your filling till just a little way from the top, about level with your turnover. And I've really packed that filling in there to create a nice flat little space. So essentially what we're creating here is a little socket for our bead to sit in. So it will sit in and rotate like that. So we've got to have it nice and packed, flat and firm. So our next step is we want to seal that section there. And we're going to do that with just a simple piece, a circle of felt. I've given you some templates there that show you the size to cut that, and we're just going to glue that one into place. So I've got my clear craft glue, and I'm just going to be quite liberal with that. We want to form a little socket type plug. And really want that to be glued up there. Spread that around. And then I'm simply going to pop that little felt piece. It's just felt, it has nothing else added to the back of that. And you really want to push that in. And a good thing to do while you're doing this is get your bead, which you have. The beads for the legs are about 25 millimeters. The beads for the arms are about 20 millimeters. Now they're readily available everywhere, these wooden beads. I like the ones that have a bit of shine to them, so a bit of a finish, just because they slip really well. But of course you can use any coloured beads you like, because they're not seen, because our animal is wearing clothing. But I just get mine from my local craft store. You can certainly buy them online, and they're very inexpensive, and they just make the best joint. And while it's a little time consuming, it's not difficult. So there we go. That just encourages that little pocket. So we've got that beautiful little pocket there that we now leave to dry. Now you go ahead and you do the same with the lower part of your limb. Now this is the arm, so you can see that that's been treated in exactly the same way. Fill it up, turn it under, hem it, and then add that little glue socket there. So now with the legs, the lower legs, the same thing. Fill them up, turn it under, and add your little socket plug as well. However, when I put these dolls together, I actually add my epoxy sculpt, which is my clay, into the foot. So I actually put clay down there and fill the foot with the clay, which is self-hardening, so it hardens in there. My reason for doing that is I can really mould the little foot while it's drying, while it's setting, and also it gives a beautiful weight and drop to the bottom, the lower leg. And when you pick up the doll, it has that lovely lifelike feel with those little heavy legs. This is totally optional. So you can fill up these lower legs nice and firm, or you can stay with me and watch as I fill with my epoxy sculpt, which I will show you now. So this is exciting. Let me introduce you all to epoxy sculpt. Now we've got my 2 pots here. I buy the large size, but you can buy it in smaller quantities. I buy it in the natural colour. It actually ends up sort of a light grey when it's cured. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some part A, and I'm going to estimate about what I will need to fill the inside of one of those feet. So I'm going to roll that into a ball, and then I just need to take basically the same amount of part B. So it's an epoxy clay, so it's activated when you mix the two together. Very, very easy to work with. So we have to make sure that quantities are the same. It is an eyeball thing. It's something that you just look. I guess you could go to extremes and weigh it. I've never felt the need to do that. So just make sure that you're mixing 2 pieces of about the same volume. I think I've got that about right there. Take a little more off of this one. And then we can go ahead and mix those together. Do always make sure to reseal those lids. Now in this case, I'm not colouring my clay. This clay can be coloured with acrylic paints and mixed in. We will definitely be doing that when we start making the horns, our little horns for our goat. But you can see that all I need to do is work those 2 pieces together. Twisting, rolling, folding it back on itself, and keep mixing until there's no streaks and it's a one uniform colour. There we go. So once I feel satisfied that my clay is all beautifully mixed together, this is just a little tip. Every time I sculpt, I always take a little piece and I put it aside. So I'm working on baking paper here. It's silicone paper that you use for cooking. So there's my little scrap. I always do that because I can watch it and see where it's at in its curing process. And once you put the product into the animal, it can be difficult to tell how firm it's getting. So then I've divided that into approximately two equal pieces, one for each foot. Now I'm going to take my gloves off. I just use disposable gloves for mixing, but I sculpt without gloves. So the other thing you're going to need is a non-stick agent, which I just use a fine baby powder. So I've got my baby powder there already, and I'm going to get a little on my fingers because this is basically a glue clay, so it's quite sticky. So I'm going to start with one little piece and I'm going to roll it up, and then I'm going to roll it in my powder. That's just so that it's not going to stick to the sides of my limb as I'm dropping it in there. And I will also add a little powder to my forceps. So I'm going to grab that little piece of clay and guide it down to the end of the foot. I don't want to ruin my forceps, so I always use something like, you can use a wooden stick, a knitting needle like I am here, and I'm going to push that clay all the way into the toe. I'm using the powder so that my tool doesn't stick and I can really get that packed in. So next piece. So basically what's happening is this clay is starting to cure. So from this moment, it's going to be getting harder. You've got a working time of probably, it can be up to half an hour where it's still workable. But that changes depending on the weather. It's something that after you've worked with it for a while, you know exactly the different stages it goes through. And sometimes I like it to sit a little while before I even start working with it. But you really will get a feel for it. So you can see I'm just packing it in there, just like you would stuffing. And I don't know if anybody else has ever done this, but this is just something that I did to create that beautiful, perfect little, it's almost like a little porcelain doll foot, but still with that lovely softness of the fabric. As much as I love dolls, classically sculpted dolls, I do very much like the softness of textiles. So I prefer felt dolls. So you can see I'm just packing it in, just like I would if I was filling with my stuffing, and little pieces because you don't want it getting caught on the way down. Always rolling it, and that little bit of talcum powder isn't going to affect the adhesion, so you don't need to worry about that. Again, packing it in. I'm going to keep packing that foot until I've used up all of my clay, because I don't want to waste any. So I may even come up to as far as up to the top of the ankle there. I'm going to keep filling, then I'm going to show you how I mould it as it dries. So that's all of that clay gone into that foot. It's filled about up to the top of the ankle there. So, and I've pressed down on the front of that toe. I want to flatten out that toe section to create that natural sort of shaped foot. Now, while the clay is still warm and soft, I'm going to add some filling into there, and the filling will attach itself to that clay and become a part of it. Pack that in, and I'm going to fill this lower limb about 3/4 full, just as we did before. So that we can then turn that top edge under and do exactly what we did with the top part of the leg there. Follow that same procedure there. But what I like to do is have it filled to about that level, and then I can let that clay cure for a couple of hours. Now, the epoxy sculpt is fully cured in 24 hours, but it's actually very solid within a couple of hours. So it's a great time frame for working on it. You can come back and still play with it. And I will continue while this is setting to come back and keep pressing that down. I just want to be encouraging that to be nice and flat and that little foot shape. While that is curing, I will go ahead and I will fill the other foot, and I will have them next to each other, and I will just keep giving them a little squeeze every now and then during the curing process. And remember, I've got my little piece here so I can really see where it's at. So just to show you the finished result when we do this, when we fill the little feet, on my other little goat that I showed you earlier, his feet are full of epoxy sculpt right up to the ankle there, and so you can see that's absolutely solid, and the benefit of it is a perfectly shaped little foot, but also it means that they can wear shoes. It also means that they can be freestanding because you've got that beautiful solid base. And for the doll that we're making here with the seated doll body, it's just that beautiful drop of the legs and that weight that it just makes it such a professional product. So those are my reasons for doing it. Like I said, you don't have to, and certainly I only do that in the feet. I don't do that in the hands. We want the hands to still be just that soft stuffing. But look, it's just that extra step that I take, and I think it's really, really worth it. When you finish one of these and you use the clay in it and you pick up the doll, you'll just love the feel of it. So I'm going to go ahead, get both of those filled, and I will have them all ready with their little sockets ready so that I can show you how to actually add that bead and create that joint. So now that we have all of our limb pieces ready, you can see that clay has hardened beautifully and those feet there and those ends are all prepared. I'm going to demonstrate how to add that bead ball joint on the arms. So we start with our upper arm. Now I've got a medium-sized doll needle with a double strand of extra strong thread, and the little ball joint sits like this. So the holes are either side so that the arm works this way. So we start in our little pocket there that we've made, halfway between those two seams, right in the middle, and as close to the top as you can. So I usually find it's around about 5 or 6 millimeters that I come out there. You've got to remember we're going through some glue there. So that knot is hidden. So our next step is to go straight through our bead, and this is the 20 millimeter bead that we use for the arms. Pull that one through, and then we're going to go straight in the opposite side, straight across in the same way. Take that through, and we've got our bead. If we pull that up, we've got that bead settled nicely in that socket. You can see there, it just slips in well. So then we just travel across through the bead again. Important to keep that tension up. Going to go back into the same hole, or very close to it, back through the other side. So it's really just like sewing on a big bulky button. Keeping it nice and straight, pulling it in each time, travelling across, pulling on those threads independently, and you'll create a really strong little hinge for that bead to rotate on. And I think the ball joints done this way, even when you look at the naked doll, it's so lovely to see all of those workings. I just think it's really nice. And if you're doing something in colours, you can even colour coordinate the beads. So there we go. Back through, and I'm going to continue doing that. I probably do that about 6 times. And then just come through on your last stitch, come through and back through here and just cast off somewhere on the inside of the arm where that won't be seen. Not that often, snip your thread ends. So I'm going to do my last couple of stitches and then we'll add the lower arm. So to add the lower arm, we just do exactly the same thing. We go in at the side, right in the middle, with our double thread, knot in the end. We're going to add our lower arm, so we're going to pass through that bead. And again, go all the way across, coming out that same spot. And that will pull our little arm together. Again, holding that nice and snug, taking your needle through, back and forth in exactly the same way as we just had with the top section, back and forth and cast off again. There we go, and there we have the perfect little, very simple ball joint. So all you need to do is go ahead with your larger size beads, which are a 25mm, and do the same for those legs and get those all ready to go. Now the final step that I do, once I have my arms, legs and my body made, I do this for every one of my art dolls. I create a little base, sort of like a turtleneck little shirt that becomes part of the doll. And I do that because I think it softens the neck join area, and it's a good basis for any kind of layered clothing that I want to add over the top. If you are a dressmaker, of course, you might feel comfortable going ahead and creating your own clothing for these dolls. I'm going to be adding to this, we're going to be making a sweet little pair of overalls. We are going to be making some little socks and some shoes. And I will be adding probably a little hand knitted cardigan over mine, and we will be making a little bag. But we will, you can layer these up any way you like, and that is just the style that I dress mine in. You could do something, you know, completely unique for yours. But this is just a really simple way to create. You can see it here on my other little goat. There, we've got that little turtleneck there. The sleeves are added before the arms are joined to the body. So it's all done very differently. It means you cannot remove these. You can't remove the actual shirt. So if you're not happy with that, then by all means create something different. So what I do is I have an old t-shirt. Well, it's actually not an old one, it's brand new, but I did thrift it, and it's exactly the colour I'm after. And so the reason why I use an old t-shirt is, first of all, they're usually only a couple of dollars from the thrift shop, and you already have a nice hemmed edge, and it makes laying out our pattern pieces and making this up really quick and easy. So first of all, I've given that a good press and made sure that those edges are all lined up. And then what I do is, you've got your pattern templates and you'll find that you've got a little undershirt there. So I line that top neck edge up with the lower end of the t-shirt. So that will create that lovely binding. We don't have to do anything at all. The lower edge of the shirt, because it's a knit fabric, it will be cut and it won't fray away. So I don't treat that edge, but you could turn it up and hem it if you like. And in the same way, we've got the little sleeve, and I line that up so that the cuff of the sleeve, it has that same binding. So we're just utilising, and I like upcycling, so it works for me. So what I've done is I've traced around each of those shapes. We've got our two sleeves, leave room between because you have to cut those out. And also mark in, you've got two little joint marks because we need to make a little hole on one side of that sleeve at the shoulder to slip over that bolt. By the same token, we also have two marks on the side here. Pop those in. Those are for the marks for when we go to join the arms through that skivvy into the body section. So you can see I've just traced around each of those pieces just with a fine marker. And then I'm going to pin those together just so that it all stays put. And I'll just add a couple with all of those pieces. Make sure these edges are really lined up because those are your visible edges. And then I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm just going to stitch exactly on that line with all of those pieces. Leave this bottom edge open, that's the lower edge of your shirt, straight around, and just with I actually sew it. I don't even use a stretch needle, but you certainly can if you want to. I find it stitches up perfectly well on the machine. So, and once we've done that, we can then cut those pieces out, leaving just a small seam allowance there. Now I've now gone ahead and cut out each of those pattern pieces, and I've just left about a 5mm seam allowance. You can see there with each one. Make sure that you make your little hole for that joint spot, and we'll just turn that little arm through. And you can see we've got a lovely cuff and a lovely neck edge that we don't have to do much work to achieve. So it is a great way, and I always keep the rest of that shirt, because there's parts of that t-shirt that we can use further along the track. And adding the arm is as simple as tucking that one in. Pulling that sleeve down. If you don't have a t-shirt and you want to just work with some knit fabric, of course you can do that, and you can just turn up a little hem in those appropriate areas. And also, I've got my sleeves quite long. I like them with a little bit of bunching up there, and you can see that's just given us that lovely little sleeve. It'll look like just a normal little long sleeve t-shirt. So here I am back, and I have created my Dalmatian body parts, just as you saw in the previous clips. And I've got my body done, legs, arms, and that tail. Also my two sleeves and my torso undershirt piece made up in that fleece. I haven't put the sleeves on the arms yet, because I'm going to be adding a few spots when we're airbrushing onto those paws. We're also going to be airbrushing just a couple of spots on the tail. So now we can move ahead to chapter 2 and create that head.